September 22nd, 1945, Camp Grant, Illinois. A dense fog rolls off the Rock River, smothering the prison yard in a cold, grey haze. It is a night designed for disappearing. While the American guards patrol the perimeter, their attention dulled by the end of the war 4 months prior, 24-year-old Georg Gärtner is moving through the shadows with the precision of a hunted animal. He slides under the first layer of barbed wire, the metal barbs inches from his spine. The ground is wet and the air smells of coal smoke and damp earth. In the distance, the whistle of a freight train bound for California screams into the night. This is his lifeline. Gärtner is not escaping to return to a defeated Germany. He is escaping to vanish. As he leaps onto the moving boxcar, leaving his prisoner number behind in the mud, he begins a 40-year game of cat and mouse with the FBI. A deception so perfect that he will eventually teach American children in an American school, while his face hangs on wanted posters in the local post office. To understand why a man would choose a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, we must first look at the army he fled from. May 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. The war for Georg Gärtner ended not with a bang, but with a thirst so deep it felt like dying. He was a 22-year-old sergeant in Field Marshal Rommel's Afrika Corps, a unit once feared for its lightning speed and tactical brilliance. But by the spring of 1943, the Desert Foxes were trapped against the sea, starved of fuel, ammunition, and water. When the final order to surrender came, Gärtner was one of 275,000 Axis soldiers who marched into Allied captivity. He expected to be shot or left to rot in a sun-baked holding pen. Instead, he was swept up into the massive industrial machinery of the United States logistics system. He was marched onto a Liberty ship in Casablanca. For the first time in months, he was given clean water and regular meals. The journey across the Atlantic was a revelation. Gärtner, like many German soldiers, had been fed a steady diet of Nazi propaganda, claiming that American cities were in ruins and its navy destroyed by U-boats. As the ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia, the reality shattered the lie. He saw harbors choked with new warships. He saw cities glowing with electric light, unbothered by blackouts or bombers. He saw a nation that seemed to possess infinite resources. The psychological impact was immediate. Gärtner realized Germany could not possibly win this war. From Virginia, he was loaded onto a Pullman train, a luxury carriage with velvet seats, headed for the American interior. The prisoners were fed ham, eggs, and white bread, food they hadn't seen in years. As the train rolled through the vast cornfields of the Midwest, Gärtner sat by the window, watching the untouched landscape slide by. The destination was Camp Grant, near Rockford, Illinois. It was a sprawling facility on the banks of the Rock River, housing thousands of German POWs. Here, the war felt 1,000,000 miles away. The prisoners worked in canneries and on local farms to replace the American labor shortage. They were paid 80 cents a day. They played soccer, organized orchestras, and attended classes. Gärtner was an intelligent, introspective young man. He did not spend his time brooding or plotting sabotage. Instead, he looked at the strange, prosperous country around him and decided to understand it. He began to learn English with a voracious intensity, mastering the slang, the rhythm, and the idioms of the Midwest. He became a model prisoner, eventually serving as a translator for the camp administration. For 2 years, Camp Grant was a sanctuary. It was safe, warm, and fed him better than the Wehrmacht ever had. But as 1945 approached and the Third Reich collapsed, the atmosphere in the camp shifted from relief to terror. A new enemy was rising in the east, and a piece of paper signed by 3 old men in Yalta was about to seal Georg Gärtner's fate. For Georg Gärtner, Camp Grant became a university of survival. While other prisoners spent their wages on beer and cigarettes, Gärtner invested in his own transformation. He noticed that America was a linguistic minefield. Speaking English was not enough. To pass as a native, one had to think like an American. He studied the guards intensely. He memorized the way they slumped when they walked, the slang they used to complain about the weather, and the casual disrespect they showed for authority, traits completely alien to the rigid discipline of the Wehrmacht. He read the Chicago Tribune and Life magazine every day, absorbing the pop culture and the geography of this massive continent. By the summer of 1945, Gärtner spoke English with a near flawless accent, though he still retained a slight, unplaceable lilt that he would later attribute to a fictional Norwegian grandmother. But as the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the atmosphere in the camp darkened. The radios that had once played jazz now broadcast the grim geopolitical realities of the post-war world. The Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, had met at Yalta to carve up the map of Europe. The news that reached Camp Grant was catastrophic for Gärtner. Under the terms of the agreement, his hometown of Schweidnitz in Silesia had been wiped off the German map. It was now part of Poland, firmly under the iron grip of the Soviet Union. Then came the rumors, whispered in the barracks at night, and eventually confirmed by the camp administration. The United States had agreed to a policy of repatriation based on the prisoner's place of origin. Those from the American, British or French zones of occupation would be sent home to rebuild West Germany, but those from the East, men like Gärtner, would be handed over to the Soviets. For a German soldier who had served on the Eastern Front, this was a death sentence. Reports of the gulags, of the brutal treatment of German POWs in Siberia, and the mass executions of officers were common knowledge. Gärtner realized with terrifying clarity that the Americans were preparing to ship him directly into the hands of Joseph Stalin. The logic of his situation shifted instantly. He was no longer a prisoner of war waiting for peace. He was a man waiting for execution. On the morning of September 21st, 1945, the repatriation orders were posted. Gärtner's unit was scheduled to be shipped out the following week. He returned to his bunk, packed a small kit bag, and made a decision that would erase his identity for the next 4 decades. He would not go back. He would become a ghost in the machine of the American Midwest. The freight train rattled west, carrying Georg Gärtner away from the cornfields of Illinois and into the vast, empty spaces of the American West. Inside the boxcar, huddled against the cold steel in his Wehrmacht field jacket, he was no longer Sergeant Gärtner. He was a ghost. The journey was a physical and psychological gauntlet. For 3 days and nights he rode the rails, jumping from train to train in rail yards from Nebraska to Wyoming. He ate raw corn stolen from fields and drank from cattle troughs. He was driven by a singular, consuming paranoia that every police siren, every conductor's whistle was the sound of the FBI closing in. When he finally jumped off a slow-moving train in Northern California, he was exhausted, filthy, and starving. He was also free. But freedom in 1945 America was a dangerous proposition for a man with no papers, no social security number, and a German accent. He needed a new skin. Gärtner realized that he could not pass as an American born in the Midwest. His vowels were too round, his cadence was too precise. So he invented a lie that would hold for 40 years. He became Dennis Wiles. He crafted a backstory that was tragic enough to discourage questions. He was a Norwegian immigrant, orphaned young, raised in foster homes, and drifting west looking for work. The accent, he explained, was the result of a childhood spent in a Scandinavian enclave. It was a brilliant cover. Few Americans in rural California knew what a Norwegian accent actually sounded like, and in the chaotic post-war economy, millions of men were drifting across the country looking for a fresh start. Dennis Wiles was just another face in the crowd, but the early years were brutal. To stay off the grid, he had to take the jobs that no one else wanted, jobs that paid cash and asked no questions. He worked as a migrant laborer in the Central Valley, picking grapes and tomatoes under the baking sun until his hands were raw. He washed dishes in greasy diners in Sacramento, keeping his head down, speaking only when necessary. He moved constantly, never staying in one town for more than a few months. He lived in boarding houses with transients and alcoholics, men who were too consumed by their own demons to notice the disciplined, polite young man in room 4B. His most dangerous moments came from his own competence. In 1946, he took a job as a lumberjack near the Oregon border. The work was dangerous, but Gärtner, physically fit from his army training, excelled at it. The problem was the social aspect. In the evenings, the men would gather around the radio to listen to news reports about the Nuremberg trials. Gärtner had to sit there, stone-faced, as the announcer detailed the atrocities of the regime he had fought for. He had to nod along when his co-workers spat on the floor and cursed the Nazis. He realized then that he was living in a state of permanent cognitive dissonance. He was the enemy in the room, sharing cigarettes with men who would have happily turned him in for the bounty. The FBI was indeed hunting him. They had realized quickly that Gärtner was not a typical escapee. Most POWs who escaped during the war were caught within days, usually found drinking in a local bar or trying to buy a ticket back to Germany. Gärtner had vanished into the ether. They issued wanted posters with his photograph, describing him as intelligent, athletic, and fluent in English. Every time Gärtner walked into a post office to buy a stamp, he saw his own face staring back at him from the wall. He would feel the adrenaline spike, his heart hammering against his ribs, but he forced himself to walk calmly, buy his stamp, and leave. He learned to live with the fear until it became a background hum, a constant companion that kept him sharp, silent, and utterly alone. But as the years passed, the drifter lifestyle began to wear on him. He craved stability. He craved the life he saw in the magazines, the American dream. And in the mountains of California, he found a way to stop running, by hiding in the most visible place possible. In the high Sierras of California, the air was thin and cold, reminiscent of the Silesian winters of his youth, but without the memories of war. Here, amidst the deep powder of the Sugar Bowl ski resort, Georg Gärtner stopped running and started performing. He realized a profound psychological truth. The best place to hide a needle is not in a haystack, but in a stack of needles. He reinvented himself as an elite ski instructor. It was a role that fit him perfectly. He was athletic, handsome, and possessed a strict, almost military discipline that his wealthy American clients mistook for European charm. He taught movie stars and politicians how to parallel turn. He was photographed for local newspapers, smiling in his ski gear, his face exposed to the world, yet utterly invisible. He was no longer the fugitive Sergeant Gärtner. He was Dennis Wiles, the quiet Norwegian bachelor. In 1964, the deception deepened into tragedy. He met Jean Clark, a calm, kind-hearted American woman. They fell in love. But for Gärtner, intimacy was a minefield. He married her, but he could never truly know her, because to be known was to be destroyed. He built a wall of silence around his past. He told Jean he was an orphan, that he had no family photos, no old letters, no history before 1945. When she asked about his childhood in Norway, he invented vague stories about fjords and snow, terrified that one day she would meet a real Norwegian and the charade would collapse. He refused to have children, terrified that a birth certificate or a background check would expose him. The psychological toll of this double life was crushing. For 40 years, Georg Gartner essentially murdered his own identity. He forced himself to think in English, to dream in English. He suppressed his mother tongue so violently that he eventually began to lose it. He was a man who had exiled himself from his own soul. He lived in a state of hypervigilance that became a chronic, silent torture. If a police cruiser pulled up behind his car at a traffic light, his hands would sweat on the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, waiting for the lights to flash. If the doorbell rang unexpectedly, his heart would hammer against his ribs. He developed a mental map of the exits in every room he entered. He was a man living in a glass house, terrified of stones. And while he played tennis at the country club and barbecued in his suburban backyard, pretending to be the perfect American husband, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was refusing to let the ghost of Camp Grant fade away. While Dennis Wiles was building a life of suburban respectability in Colorado and California, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was quietly seething. For the FBI, the Georg Gertner file was a source of professional embarrassment. By the 1970s and 80s, every other escaped German POW in American history, all 2,222 of them, had been accounted for. Most had been caught within days. The clever ones had lasted a few months. Only one man remained at large. Gertner was the Bureau's ghost. His file, thick with dusty reports and dead-end leads, sat on a desk in Washington, D.C., a testament to a failure of surveillance. They had his fingerprints. They had his mugshot from 1943. They had his physical description: 5'11", blue eyes, scar on the left index finger. Yet he had simply evaporated into the American landscape. The FBI assumed he had returned to Germany under a false name, or perhaps died in a vagrant camp, his body unidentified. But they never stopped looking. They periodically refreshed his wanted poster, digitally aging his face to predict what the 24-year-old sergeant would look like at 40, then 50, then 60. These posters hung in post offices across the nation, often just feet away from where Dennis Wiles stood in line to mail bills for his construction consulting business. The irony was staggering. The man the US government was hunting as an enemy combatant was, by all accounts, a model American citizen. He paid his taxes scrupulously, terrified that an audit would reveal his lack of a birth certificate. He volunteered in his community. He was a loving, if distant, husband. He was living the very ideal of the society he had once fought against. But by the early 1980s, the walls began to close in. It wasn't the FBI that cracked the case. It was the sheer weight of the lie. Technology was advancing. The computerized databases of the modern world were making it increasingly difficult to live without a valid social security number or a verifiable past. Gertner watched as the world moved from paper records to digital surveillance, knowing that one day a computer in Washington would flag the anomaly of Dennis Wiles. More importantly, his marriage to Jean was fracturing under the strain of his silence. For nearly 20 years, she had lived with a man who had no past. He refused to travel internationally, claiming a fear of flying. He refused to visit her relatives if it involved crossing borders. He refused to talk about his childhood. Jean, patient but confused, began to wonder if her husband was a criminal. Was he a bank robber? A murderer running from a cold case? The silence in their home grew deafening. Finally, in 1984, she issued an ultimatum. She sat him down and told him that she could no longer live with a stranger. Either he told her who he really was, or she was leaving. Gartner looked at his wife, the woman he loved, the woman he had lied to every single day for 2 decades. He was 64 years old. He was tired of running. He was tired of flinching at sirens. The fear of the Soviets, which had driven him to jump that fence in 1945, had faded into the geopolitical stalemate of the Cold War. He realized that he was a prisoner again, not of barbed wire, but of his own deception. On a quiet afternoon in their California home, Georg Gertner finally let the ghost speak. He looked at Jean and uttered the words he hadn't said in 40 years. My name is not Dennis Wiles. I was a German soldier. I escaped from a prisoner of war camp in 1945. The confession hung in the air of their suburban living room, shattering the reality Jean Wiles had lived in for 20 years. She did not scream. She did not run. She sat in stunned silence as her husband, the mild-mannered tennis pro and construction consultant, unspooled a story that sounded like a Hollywood screenplay. He told her about the Africa Corps, the train ride to Illinois, the fear of the Soviets, and the 40 years of looking over his shoulder. Jean's reaction was not horror, but relief. He wasn't a murderer. He wasn't a domestic abuser. He was a survivor of a war that had ended before they met. But relief quickly turned to a new kind of terror. Her husband was still, technically, an escaped enemy combatant. He was a fugitive from the United States Army. Together, they made a decision that was both reckless and brilliant. Gertner knew that if he simply walked into a police station, he would be arrested, thrown into a military brig, and likely deported to a Germany he no longer knew. He needed leverage. He needed the court of public opinion. He decided to turn himself in, not to the police, but to the media. He contacted a history professor named Arnold Kramer, an expert on POWs in America, who helped him navigate the legal labyrinth. Then they reached out to the biggest platform in the country, the Today Show. On the morning of September 11th, 1985, almost exactly 40 years after he crawled under the wire at Camp Grant, Georg Gertner flew to New York City. He sat in the green room, his heart pounding harder than it had on the freight trains. He was about to reveal his face to millions of Americans. When the cameras rolled, Bryant Gumbel, the host, leaned forward. You are the last escaped German prisoner of war in America. Why come forward now? Gertner, looking every bit the elderly American grandfather in his suit and tie, looked into the lens and spoke with a quiet dignity. He explained that he wanted to be free. He explained that he had lived an honest life. He explained that the statute of limitations on his escape had technically run out, but his immigration status was a legal black hole. It was a masterstroke. By surrendering on live television, Gertner made it impossible for the government to quietly disappear him. He humanized himself. He wasn't a Nazi monster hiding in the shadows. He was Dennis, the guy next door who had made a desperate choice in a terrifying time. As the interview ended, the FBI agents who were watching in Washington were stunned. They didn't need to launch a raid. Their most wanted fugitive had just given them his address on national TV. The ghost of Camp Grant had finally stopped running. The cameras turned off, the studio lights dimmed, and Georg Gertner waited for the handcuffs. They never came. Instead of being dragged away by federal agents, Gertner walked out of the NBC studios and into a bureaucratic twilight zone that would baffle legal scholars for years. His public surrender had created a legal paradox that the United States government was completely unprepared to handle. The Department of Justice was paralyzed. Technically, Gertner was an escaped prisoner of war, a crime punishable by court-martial. However, the war had been over for 40 years. The United States was now allies with West Germany. Furthermore, the statute of limitations for escape was only a few years. He couldn't be prosecuted for running away in 1945. The Immigration and Naturalization Service was equally confused. They wanted to deport him as an illegal alien. But Gartner's lawyer pointed out a crucial, undeniable fact. Georg Gartner had not entered the country illegally. He had been brought to the United States against his will on a government troop ship by the United States Army. He had been invited in the most aggressive sense possible. Therefore, he was not an illegal immigrant. He was a guest who had overstayed his welcome by 4 decades. While the lawyers argued, the court of public opinion delivered its verdict swiftly. The American public fell in love with Dennis Wiles. To them, he wasn't a Nazi fugitive. He was the ultimate immigrant success story. He was a man who had come to America with nothing, worked hard, paid his taxes, loved his wife, and contributed to his community. Letters of support flooded into newspapers and the INS offices. Neighbors in California who had known him for years were shocked, but they rallied around him. "He's a good neighbor," they told reporters. "He shovels our driveway in the winter. Who cares about the war?" The FBI, realizing that arresting an elderly tennis coach who was currently a media darling would be a public relations disaster, quietly closed the file. They essentially shrugged. For months, Gartner lived in a strange limbo. He was free, but stateless. He was a man without a country. Finally, in 1986, the bureaucracy relented. The INS granted him permanent resident status. The government officially recognized that the war was over. The ghost of Camp Grant was finally, legally, alive. But for Gertner, legal status was only half the battle. There was one final ghost he had to confront. He had to go back to the place where Georg Gertner had died in 1945. He had to go home. In 1986, carrying a newly issued alien registration card, Georg Gertner boarded a plane to Frankfurt. It was the first time he had left American soil in 41 years. The man who sat in the window seat was physically German, but psychologically, he was a creature of the American West. He dressed like a Coloradan, thought in English, and even dreamt in the cadence of his adopted tongue. He was returning to a country that existed only in his memory, a memory frozen in the fanaticism and destruction of 1945. What he found was a shock. The ruins were gone. The swastikas were gone. In their place was a hyper-modern democratic West Germany, bustling with Mercedes taxis and neon signs. He felt like a time traveler stepping into a future he didn't understand. The reunion with his family was the emotional crescendo of his life. He traveled to find his younger sister, Lotta. For decades, his family had believed he was dead. They had received a notice in 1945 listing him as missing in action. They had held a memorial service. They had mourned him and moved on. When he knocked on Lottie's door, an old woman answered. She looked at the elderly American man standing on her porch, confused. Gertner struggled to find the words. He tried to speak German, but it came out clumsy, rusted by disuse, mixed with American slang. Finally, the recognition dawned in her eyes. The ghost had come home. They embraced, weeping. But as the days passed, a bittersweet reality settled in. Gertner realized he was a stranger here. He didn't understand the politics, the humor, or the social norms of this new Germany. He felt claustrophobic. He missed the open spaces of the Rockies. He missed the informality of American life. He missed Jean. He realized that Dennis Wiles was not just a mask anymore. It was who he had become. The Nazi sergeant had died in the Illinois cornfields long ago. The man who survived was an American. He returned to the United States, not as a fugitive, but as a resident. In 2009, at the age of 88, Georg Gertner passed away in Loveland, Colorado. He died under his own name, but to the neighbors who attended his funeral, he would always be Dennis, the quiet, polite man who played a mean game of tennis and kept a secret that was bigger than the war itself. The story of Georg Gärtner is more than just an escape thriller. It is a profound meditation on the fluidity of identity. For 40 years, Gärtner lived a paradox. He was a soldier of the Third Reich who embodied the American dream. He was a criminal who lived a life of impeccable lawfulness. He proved that a man is not defined by the uniform he wears at 20, but by the choices he makes for the rest of his life. In the end, Gärtner's greatest escape was not from Camp Grant, or from the FBI, or even from the Soviet threat. It was an escape from history itself. He managed to step out of the dark shadow of the swastika and invent a life defined by freedom, reinvention, and the quiet dignity of the individual. He was the last prisoner of World War II, and when he finally surrendered, he taught us that sometimes the only way to truly win a war is to stop fighting it.